FM বেণ্ডৰ 90.8 মেগাহাৰ্টত গুৱাহাটী বিশ্ববিদ্যালয়ৰ সামূহিক অনাতাঁৰ সেৱা ৰেডিঅ' লুইত। এয়া আগবঢ়াইছোঁ অনাতাঁৰ পাঠদান। শ্বেক্সপিয়াৰ ছনেট শীৰ্ষক বিষয়ত আজিৰ পাঠদান আগবঢ়াইছে গুৱাহাটী বিশ্ববিদ্যালয়ৰ ইংৰাজী বিভাগৰ অধ্যাপক বিভাস চৌধুৰীয়ে।
Hello students, today we are going to look at the subject of Shakespeare's Sonnet, and as you all know, Shakespeare was one of the pioneering figures in bringing the sonnet form into English literature, but he was not the one who brought it into England. The sonnet has an interesting history because it was something which started in Sicily and then through Europe, especially Italy, it traveled to England. Before Shakespeare, there were these two very interesting poets. Actually, they were also very important travelers of the time. They were Thomas Wyatt and the Earl of Surrey. And Wyatt and Surrey, during their travels, they came across the sonnet form in different European centers, especially Italy. And they found that this was a form which was not yet familiar to the people of England. So what they did was they started translating these sonnets from Latin, Italian into English. And the result of that was a very interesting book which was published in 1557. It was called Totel's Miscellany. Many of these poems were included poems which were translated by Wyatt and Surrey. Now the sonnet as a form is interesting because it doesn't give the poet or the sonneteer, as the writer of the sonnet is called, much scope to express, because that is a poem which is confined by its limits. That means usually a sonnet is a form where you have two parts. The form which is practiced in Italy, the form which Wyatt and Surrey brought to England, that form was introduced and that form was practiced widely by a poet called Petrarch. And Petrarch wrote it in a form where the first part had 8 lines and the 6th line was that it had 2 parts. And the Italian form, which was introduced in England, that was also in practice in Italy, that had 2 parts of 8 plus 6. So what these poets, Wyatt and Surrey, did was to bring this form into England and brought it in a manner that was in vogue, in practice in Italy. So by when Shakespeare was early on in his career, when he was starting to write his early plays in the 1590s, that he also started writing his sonnets. Now, interestingly, Shakespeare's sonnets were not published as a whole, as one sequence. We know that Shakespeare wrote 154 sonnets. So these sonnets were not published together until 1609. And Shakespeare's sonnets were not published with his permission. That means the publisher, Thomas Thorpe, actually brought out an edition of Shakespeare's sonnets. Shakespeare wrote 154 sonnets, and he brought out this edition without the permission of Shakespeare, with the knowledge of Shakespeare. And because at that time, during the Elizabethan age, the publication of poems was not something that was seen as important as it is today. So many of these poems by Shakespeare or his contemporaries were in circulation in written form, handwritten form, or in manuscript. And the question of copyright was not something that was followed strictly as we do today. So Shakespeare's sonnets came out in 1609 in book form without Shakespeare's knowledge, but the poems were actually written in the 1590s, and some of those poems were written a little later. The exact time of composition has not been settled yet. Some of these sonnets, those sonnets which were written before the 16th, 17th century, those sonnets of the early 1590s show a different kind of language, the language that you find in his plays like Love's Labour's Lost or As You Like It. But some of his sonnets, also later sonnets, and that is how people know that these sonnets are of a later time, have a language that is reflective of his problem plays, the plays that he wrote later. So to come back to the sonnet form, the sonnet form is not an original English form. It's an European form. It is something that was brought from the continent and was practiced by different English sonneteers. Shakespeare was not the first to write the sonnet sequence. It was something which was very fashionable in Shakespeare's time in the 1590s to write not just one sonnet or 2 sonnets or 3 or 4 sonnets, but write long sequences. That means you have sonnets which number one after another, more than 100. So Shakespeare, before Shakespeare, Edmund Spenser, who was a very important Elizabethan poet, wrote sonnet sequence. Then we have Shakespeare's contemporary Daniel writing sonnets. We have Philip Sidney, who also wrote sonnet sequences. A sonnet sequence means that there are a series of sonnets, a number of sonnets, but these sonnets are not supposedly or do not claim to have any connection like a narrative. It's not like different chapters of one novel. So they're all sonnets and they're all part of one sequence, and they show the poet's expertise, the poet's capacity, the poet's skill, craftsmanship in these different poems. Now, what Shakespeare did and what is so special about Shakespeare's sonnets is that Shakespeare, in a way, capitalized on the possibilities of the form. That the form is this is a form which is often, not always, often such that it consists of 14 lines. And Shakespeare's sonnets also has 14 lines, and each of these sonnets are divided into two parts. But unlike the Petrarchan sonnet had 8 plus 6, 4, and so therefore it became 14 lines. Shakespearean sonnets, which is also known as the English sonnet, not the Italian. The Shakespeare sonnets had two parts, where the first part was 4 plus 4 plus 4. So it had 3 stanzas of 4 lines, and each of these 3 stanzas of 4 lines are known as quatrains. A 4-line stanza is known as a quatrain. So you have these 3 4-line stanzas, and the last 2 lines are known as a couplet. So Shakespeare's sonnets have this structure where you have 12 plus 2, and the 12 is again further, you can break it up into 3 4-line stanzas. Now, the most important thing about a sonnet, not only a Shakespearean sonnet, any sonnet, the most important thing about a sonnet is a sonnet has a 2-part structure. For instance, if we just write 14 lines on a piece of paper, it doesn't become a sonnet. For a poem to be considered to be a sonnet, it must have a 2-part structure. And this 2-part structure is actually, the first part is known as the argument, when a question is placed or when a proposition is made, when something is stated. And the second part is the answer to the question, is a resolution, is a settlement of what is being proposed. So in Shakespeare's sonnets as well, and in most sonnets that we have in English language, we find this 2-part structure. If it is an Italian sonnet, if it is a sonnet where you have 8 lines plus 6 lines, then you have the question being raised in the first 8 lines. And the 6 lines that follow, they settle the question, they resolve the question, they settle the argument. A question is raised and the question is solved. So for Shakespeare, what is interesting is that Shakespeare in his sonnets dealt with a wide range of subjects, and there were variations. Variations meaning he was talking of something, you will find that Shakespeare writes on subjects which may appear similar. For instance, you have a lot of sonnets where Shakespeare talks about time. What is time? How time is all pervasive, how time takes control over everyone, how no one can escape time, how time doesn't spare kings or anyone. Everyone is subject to time, so time cannot be escaped. But then if you look at his sonnets carefully and closely, you'll find that there are variations. For instance, how does he demonstrate the power of time? Sometimes he uses, and this is known as a conceit. A conceit is a comparison. Sometimes he compares time to a sickle. Sickle is something that we use to reap the corn. When you reap the corn in agriculture, in farming, we use a sickle. So time is something that is shown as a sickle, as someone who bears a sickle, and that no one can escape time. So there are different images, and this is one of the important aspects of Shakespeare's sonnets. Thematically, if we look at Shakespeare and if we look at other sonneteers of Shakespeare's time, the most striking thing about Shakespeare is his use of the form. How does he use the form? What does he make use? What does he make with the form? It's a limited form. It's a form which doesn't offer much scope. That means it's not like an epic or not like a lyric. In a lyric, you can go on. You can develop an argument. For instance, what a sonnet doesn't give you, what a sonnet doesn't provide the sonneteer with, is the scope to develop character. For instance, you cannot write about a person and then develop. And what Shakespeare did was, within that limited space of the sonnet, he dealt with themes in very, very innovative ways, in ways that drew the attention of the reader. Now, in dealing with time, his argument was such that time is, of course, something that no one, not even nature, can overcome, because time is something that takes its toll on everything. Human beings, creatures, nature, everything is affected by time. So no one can say, I am someone who is outside the purview of time. So time takes control of everything. Time is very powerful, all powerful. Now, in most of his sonnets, what he does is that time is all powerful. He acknowledges that, and he admits that, and he shows how powerful time is through his different images. He communicates that, and when he comes to the end of the poem, the last 2 lines, he says, but there is one thing that time cannot do, and that is, time cannot change the fact that I have been able to express what I have been doing here in this poem. So time cannot take control over art. because art is something that transcends time. Otherwise, my writing would make no sense. That my writing will be read later on, even after I'm gone, is something that is a testimony, that's a proof, that is something that exemplifies the power of art over time. So what he's doing is taking advantage of the importance of art and the ability of the art and artist to move beyond the limits of time. So he raises a question which is something that concerns all of us. We all know that time is all pervasive, time is all powerful, time takes its control over everyone. And so you'll find in his sonnets on time, there are references to death, the different ways in which death comes, different ways in which death is powerful, and that spares no one. Then he turns around and says, wait, death of course will come to everyone, to me, to you, everyone. And he talks about his friend, he talks about his love, and he says that, okay, death will come and time will come and take control over all of us. But this thing that I've written, this is not something that death can take away. This will survive. He makes use of the sonnet form, and then he expresses and establishes the answer to the question that what will happen to us, what will happen to what has taken place, because our friendship is here, but once we are gone, our friendship will also be gone. So what happened? That's the question that he raises, and he settles that question. So the manner in which he makes use of the form, because there were others who also wrote sonnets before him. It's not that Shakespeare is the first Englishman to write sonnets. So there were other people who wrote sonnets. But then what Shakespeare does is to make use of the form and make use of the argumentative nature of the sonnet form. And so when you finally finish reading a sonnet, a Shakespearean sonnet, you then realize that yes, he has been able to state his case. Let's say a sonnet on the subject of time. He's been able to establish it. And he has been able to show that he's not questioning the power of time, but he is also making it clear that time doesn't have its impact over art and over love that is expressed through that art. If there's a poet who is expressing love, so if that art survives, if the poem survives, if the poem lives, then the poem's content, then the poem is a love poem, that will also live. So how this is something that extends beyond the limits of time. And so you can see he could have written an essay on it, he could have written a play on it, but he uses sonnet form. So because he is a poet of such a great stature that he is able to express, it's not easy. It may appear that this is something that comes easily to everyone. No, we don't have two Shakespeares. He was the one who did it so effectively to make it make the meaning appear to the reader and so clearly. Do you get the point?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
So I would like to know that what was the contribution of Shakespeare to the sonnet form?
Yeah, this is something which becomes very evident when we look at the importance of the sonnet form in a larger context. When you look at the sonnet, not only in terms of Shakespeare's time, but if we look at the history of the sonnet and its practice later on, we find that Shakespeare was the most important writer of English, not only in his time, but also that Shakespeare was able to write sonnets over a sequence. It's not about writing, say, 2 sonnets or 3 sonnets or 7, 8 sonnets. He was able to write a series of sonnets, 154 of them, and sustain his skill and craftsmanship and present to us a very, very wide variety of perspectives. For instance, you can say that a poet can write a sonnet on the subject of time, maybe 2 sonnets, 3 sonnets, 4 sonnets. But Shakespeare is able to write so many sonnets on one subject and approach each of these sonnets in so many different ways. So it's not easy. It's something that has not been repeated by other writers, because on the one hand, when Shakespeare was writing at the time, the tradition that was going on was known as the courtly love tradition. And that courtly love tradition was something that came to Shakespeare, and in Shakespeare's time that was in practice. Other poets were very comfortable with it. But when you look at Shakespeare, Shakespeare gave his sonnet what we today call the Shakespearean element, the Shakespearean touch. So when you look at the sonnet by Shakespeare, you immediately realize by the use of his language, his word, what is known as the Shakespearean quibble, that he plays with these words, that he plays with these different ideas, and they create that sense of playfulness which is brought about by the genius of the language. So he was able to capitalize on the resources of the English language and use images in such a manner that what we get and what we eventually find is very resourceful, very rich example of writing, which shows quality, which shows intensity, and which shows the nature of the language and the one who uses the language. So the poet's ability to transform the language and make use of those resources is something that is borne out by Shakespeare the sonneteer.
Thank you, sir.
Sir, how is the sonnets different from other form?
That's also very interesting because you see, in English we have different forms, literary forms. So the great English poet of the 7th century, John Milton, he wrote the epic, and Shakespeare is a playwright, and Shakespeare is a poet and a sonneteer. So Shakespeare also wrote long poems. It's not that sonnet is a short form, and Shakespeare wrote long narrative poems. How is this sonnet form different from other forms? First thing, that sonnet is a form which is known because of its brevity, means because of its shortness of length. It's not a long. And you have other poems like the epic, like the long narrative poem, like the lyric, like the ballad, like the elegy. An elegy is a poem about lamentation. It's a poem about grief. A ballad can be on different subjects. A ballad is a long poem. Then you have the ode. Ode is also a form that is practiced in English, which we saw especially practiced by the Romantic poets. These are long poems. These are poems which have a longer duration, and they are spread over a long period, so that you can write say poem about say 24 lines, 30 lines, and you can make it into ode. Wordsworth wrote the Immortality Ode, which was quite long. But sonnet is a form which is known for, and which is something that is designed in a way that shows its compact structure. So most sonnets, I won't say all sonnets, most sonnets have 14 lines. And the nature of the sonnet as a form is that, as I told at the beginning, it is something that provides the sonneteer the scope to make use of this two-part structure. So sonnet as a form has a two-part structure. A ballad need not have this two-part structure. Two-part structure is that the first part will have the argument or proposition, and the second will have the resolution. Sometimes the proposition is something that is extended and is enhanced in the resolution. That, okay, this is what is stated, and that is further enhanced. So 14 lines is not the basic characteristic of a sonnet. It's not that a sonnet must be of 14 lines. Most sonnets are 14 lines, but all sonnets are not of 14. So as a form, the sonnet form is a form where the crucial thing is about its design, a two-part structure. And the turnaround, Shakespeare would say that I have nothing, I have lost everything, or I'm not like this person or that person. And so he would then, the speaker of, not Shakespeare, the speaker, one who is talking about the subject, would say that I don't have this and I don't have that, and that person, and look at time, and time will come and take everything away. And he may be talking to his friend, he may be telling his friend, you see, I don't have anything. And then at the end of the poem, towards the end of the poem, he would turn around and he would say, wait, there's one thing that I have, and that is my ability to express my art that is not subject to time, and it is something that will go beyond time. So that is known as a volta. It's like a bridge between the argument and the resolution. Okay, it's something that crosses over, that suddenly the speaker turns around and say, wait, this is the question, this is the problem, this is the argument, but here's the resolution. We can settle it like this. So the sonnet form is something that actually makes great demands on the poet. The poet must be very skillful, and you'll therefore find in many of Shakespeare's sonnets that there are many legal terms. So he is actually arguing like an advocate, like a lawyer. Okay, he's saying, okay, he's presenting both sides of the case, and then he is resolving, okay, this is how we settle the matter. So the sonnet as a form is in that sense unique because of the manner in which it is structured. The other poems, the longer poems, do not have such a rigidity about structure, that it must have such a structure. And when I say that sonnets are mostly of 14 lines, there are some poets who have experimented with 16-line sonnets. Usually a sonnet is of 14 lines. So within a 14-line limit, it's not something that can be extended very far, that you can really have an argument then extend it very far. So the limitation of the form is also its beauty. It's challenge to the poet, and the poet is able to then express it in such a manner that it comes true. So I think one of the interesting things about the sonnet form is that it had Shakespeare as its practitioner. That Shakespeare was someone who actually brought to the reader the resource of the form, that okay, see what can be done with such a form, because Shakespeare was using it. A writer of a lesser caliber perhaps would not have been able to draw the resources of the language, the form, and the medium in the way Shakespeare did. That's why when we read Shakespeare's sonnets, we know how wonderful the form became